Based on the way everybody's sitting in the auditorium, I'm going to teach to this side tonight. Sorry.
Maybe closer.
My sense of humor isn't appreciated much sometimes.
People on YouTube will say, where'd he go?
In my head, I'm hilarious most all the time. It's just,
That's all that matters.
that's right. We are in Isaiah chapter 34. Isaiah chapter 34. Somebody throw something at Don and tell him to sit down. You know, as I was studying and reading, I know we've talked about this many times about the kind of the subject matter being so grateful to be under the new law. I think another thing that's so difficult about studying this book for me so far is that it's not linear. He bounces all over the place sometimes, so it makes it hard to go forward and backwards and all the flashbacks and flash sideways. But tonight, I think we got mostly through chapter 33. I know, Joanne, you asked if we were going to go back. Let's go back for one or two verses, because I think they're beautiful verses, and it's just something that as Christians, there's some imagery in chapter 33 that I find encouraging. I find strengthening. And those verses would be 20, basically chapter 33, verse 20. Look upon Zion, the city of our appointed feast. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, a quiet home, a tabernacle that will not be taken down. Not one of its stakes will be removed, nor any of its cords broken. What does that say to you? What do you see there? What do you feel? What is the imagery that comes from that verse? You can think about it for them, what it meant to the people that Isaiah was writing to in the southern kingdom of Judah, but also bring it forward to us in the kingdom or the church today. And I apologize for the voice. I can't. My sinus has been killing me the past few weeks.
It's a restoration to the way things once were. Because they now have Solomon's temple in all of its glory. But now they're just talking about going back to a tabernacle. But that's the way it was in the beginning, before man messed it up.
Okay, Lee's mentioning going backwards. I was thinking more coming forward,
But it also is that.
but before man messed it up, has there ever been a time that man didn't mess something up? But in its simplest form, what is the tabernacle?
It is the dwelling place of God where the people are drawn to Him.
The dwelling place of God, the presence of God. You said where they're drawn to Him, Joanne?
And referring to the actual physical city of Jerusalem as a tent tells me it's temporary. God's in Jerusalem or in the temple or in the tabernacle temporarily.
So His place of worship, His city is temporary, but also back before men messed it up, what was this city, what were the people of God doing?
Before the fall?
The time frame that Lee's talking about, before man messed it up, when this tabernacle is in existence, what is God's people doing?
Wandering.
They're journeying,
Wandering in the desert.
they're wandering, but they're also being led by God. We get to the Hebrew letter, and we get the idea of we are sojourners, we are journeying with God. But back to what you're saying about it as a temporary thing, because we're looking forward to something that's permanent.
Absolutely.
Okay, are you starting, Benjamin?
Yeah, and so I'll follow up on that to what Joanne said, because we often think of a tent as being temporary, but the fact that this will never be folded, the stakes will never be pulled up, it has permanency. And incredible permanency is for all time permanency.
So
The New Jerusalem.
for those that can't hear, Carrie brings up permanency. But if you take with what Lee was saying, this is prior to this great temple that Solomon built, which would be one of the great wonders of the world. But God, through Isaiah, points out, going back to something that seems temporary. It seems like a tent could be destroyed, but this is permanent.
But I'm reading this somewhat figuratively.
It is figuratively, but that's why I wanted you to read it, or say it again, to go back for the imagery for us as Christians, but also for them, the dwelling place of God. And we know that as God journeyed with his people, that these things never wore out, and he provided. But it is the points that you mentioned, Carrie. It's a tabernacle, even though it was a tent that was put together. We go back, if we read within the Pentateuch, and we see how God describes each thing, each piece of fabric, each stitch, each ring, each board to build this thing. It will not be taken down. It is permanent. And the stakes that I mentioned last week, talking about how the circus would come to town, and I can go to certain places, there are parking lots here in town that we get the little carnivals going through, and we can go to right now tonight, and we can find holes where they've driven a stake in there. And to me, I like to camp, and we've been in those windstorms where our tents have gotten yanked out of the ground. And there's just something about when the stakes, the presence, the foundation of what God has laid will not be destroyed.
And he puts that word in there, undisturbed. And if you think about the situation that has already been prophesied and is about to come rolling in, there's going to be utter destruction. And yet he's saying, you're going to look to Zion, it's going to be undisturbed.
Well, this whole book has been about destruction that God's going to take. And then chapter 34 tonight, exactly. Where does it say undisturbed in your translation?
Right there in verse 20. It says, an undisturbed habitation.
The very end,
At the very end.
where the New King James, or is that the ESV? And
This is New American Standard.
New American Standard, undisturbed habitation. This says, nor will its cords be broken. So I just wanted us to go back and remind ourselves of that. For those people, they had gone through, I don't know of a good word that wouldn't be offensive or how to describe it. They've gone through some garbage. But stick with God, because God is permanent. God is security. God is everlasting. Joey?
I just need some clarification here. The way I have always read this, because in verse 21 it says, for, this, and I always saw it as a spiritual Jerusalem or the new Jerusalem yet to come, because we know Jerusalem fell, we know it was destroyed. And so it's like he says, for in verse 20, and for the majestic one, our Lord will be there. So this peaceful, secure, permanent Jerusalem is the one where our Lord is.
It is very figurative, because we've talked about just these few moments about what it meant to them, what they had gone through, the temporary Solomon's built that. But for us looking forward to Zion, or I would say it'd be figurative for us, for our kingdom, our heavenly kingdom, the presence of God, the church, it will not be destroyed, it will not be taken down. There is nothing that can prevail. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it when Christ built the church.
The Temple of Solomon was well within the reach of the Babylonians if God removed his protection away. And they destroyed it. The Romans too did in AD 70. But the Lord's church, the new Jerusalem, the tabernacle, his dwelling place now is completely out of reach from the governments of man. It is untouchable because the kingdom of God is within us.
And we really, not to cut you short, as God's people, need to understand that. Despite the fact that we go through those doors, and I heard in your class you were referencing a little bit about food and different things, we're in a screwed up age. Some days are scary. We've dealt with COVID type stuff. They're just in our human nature. We deal with diseases on a daily basis. It's easy to get overwhelmed. But we are a part of something so great that we have to understand that our God is much greater than this life. And even if my life ended tonight, if I'm in Him, I've got the promise. Gary.
And I really like how 22 brings it all together, because you know Israel had always wanted a king, but they wanted a king like all the other nations.
Right, to be like,
Yeah, but listen to this, for the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. He will save us.
He will save us. See, God didn't have a problem with having a king. Just pick the right king.
That's it.
So I just wanted to go back there. Let's get jumping to verse chapter 34 and move forward. I want us to jump down in the commentators and just start looking. Chapter 34 and chapter 35 are this comparison contrast, and you've got two different things going on. In verse 5, it mentions the word Edom. But then you get over to later on down, it starts talking about verse 8, Zion, but really, chapter 35 really talks about Zion. What is the contrast between Edom and Zion?
Edom is the hated son, the despised son, the son who rejected the inheritance, who rejected the birthright. It's Esau.
My inheritance is worth so little that I'm going to sell it for stew.
Yes. And so Jacob then would be the people that cling to God. And it's not necessarily on tribal lines, because there were plenty of those of Jacob who lived as if they were of Esau. And so Isaiah is straddling the line between covenants here. And he's speaking at once to the people into the Old Covenant, but he's also speaking about the New Covenant.
And if they can relate to it in our text so far, we've not heard like the nation of Edom really spoken about. This is a kingdom that would be south of the southern kingdom. They've not been a threat necessarily coming in. So I believe he's talking figuratively about what Leah said. This is people that are unspiritual. It's people who don't appreciate the gift or what God had given them, what they by birthright would have had. They've rejected God. So we've got chapter 34 talking about people who don't appreciate the spiritual nature of God, don't appreciate the gift of what God, and they've just turned their back on it. Versus chapter 35 will talk about Zion, which is God's people who have worshipped Him, who are loyal to Him, the place where He's going to dwell and lead. So let's read through chapter 34. Come near, you nations, to hear, and heed, you people. Let the earth hear and all that is in it, the world and all things come forth from it. The indignation of the Lord is against all nations, and His fury against all their armies. He has utterly destroyed them. He has given them over to the slaughter. Also their slain shall be thrown out. Their stench shall rise from their corpses, and the mountains shall melt with their blood. All the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and heaven shall be rolled up like a scroll. And their host shall fall down as the leaf falls from the vine and the fruit falling from the fig tree. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Indeed, it shall come down on Edom and on people of my curse for judgment. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It's made overflowing with fatness, with the blood of lambs and goats, the fat of the kidneys of the rams. For the Lord has sacrificed in Borah, and great slaughter in the land of Edom. The wild oxen shall come down with them, and the young bulls with the mighty bulls. Their land shall be soaked with blood, and their dust saturated with fatness. Let's pause there for a minute and go back. You see that he starts off by calling out that people listen, people hear. God is pronouncing this judgment against what group of people we've just said? Is it a nation, or is it a type of person? We just talked about the Edomites were Edom, Esau, rejected his birthright, sold it off because he didn't value it. It's people who aren't valuing a relationship with God. It's not necessarily talking figuratively about a certain country, but just as he's calling out to all nations, listen to me, hear the world and all its things come forth from it. God's indignation, what does indignation mean? He's angry, he's frustrated, he's annoyed because of what? The injustice, the way they've treated people, because they don't have a relationship with him, because they're not holy people. So all of the people that are not holy of the world, even today, God, it's kind of prophetic about what they were going through, but also believe that if you read this and listen to it, what's going to happen at the end of time? God's people are called up to be with him, and the others are not called up. What's going to happen? As he talks here, listen to how the destruction, utterly destroyed. The slain shall be thrown out, their stench rise from the corpses. Not even given the courtesy of a true burial, but just rotting in the streets. The mountains shall melt with their blood. Kind of the concept or the imagery that the bloodshed is so great that it would cause erosion and avalanche down the mountain because the blood's just washing it away. But heaven itself rolled up like a scroll. What does it mean when a scroll is rolled up? Can't be read. It can't be seen.
The message is ended.
They're not able to see the God of creation. They're not able to receive the message. So these are unspiritual people who are rejecting God. And then God is coming down. And what is the imagery? Verses 5 and following. What's going on there? What's the picture being painted?
Bloody massacre.
It is a bloody massacre. What'd you say, Carrie?
Well, when I read this, it looks like everything's ending. It's the world, the nations are ending, and the universe is coming to a close. It sounds like it. And they are now, because they have not sacrificed and served God, now it's their own blood.
Sacrifice. And who's the one laying them on the altar? God. And he's doing a representation that they understood the sacrifice, they understood the relationship with God, what sacrifice was supposed to be. And because they've not done what they should have done, now their blood is required. And it's with the blood of the lambs, midway through verse 6, the fat of the kidneys. The Lord has sacrificed. And here was a city that was known, and I read about it, it slipped my mind, I didn't write it in my notes here. One of their powerful cities that would have been a leading city, and God is going into their fortified city and is still able to produce or do his judgment and take care of the need. But you're right, it's showing God's righteousness, it's showing sacrifice will be made to God, but in this case, he's the one doing the sacrificing because they have not. Any other thought? Yes, Lee?
There is a sense here that God is turning civilization into a wasteland. And then in chapter 35, out of the wasteland comes the glorious Zion. And so he's going to destroy the old and bring forth the new. And that's true of the covenant of Moses, but it's also true of the ways of the idolaters and these empires that were just bloodthirsty. Here you got about a 600-year span, and you're going to go through the Babylonians, the Persians, the Macedonians, and the Romans are all just going to crisscross all through this area and just jumble everything up, including mixing the blood of people. And it was to that world that the gospel went out.
When you're in your first few comments about turning the land to desolation, and we'll really start to see that in the second part of the chapter, but you're absolutely right. That's part of the comparison and contrast of the two chapters. That even in the beginning of this chapter where it's talking about destroy them, giving them over to the slaughter, they're slain, thrown, just when you read the first part of chapter, or verse 3, and their slain shall be thrown out, can anybody almost get an aroma in your nose, your nostrils, and your head right now if I were to say their stench shall rise like corpse? It's a putrid smell. What has caused that? Death. Death is correct. Death will cause the body to decay. But are we talking about physical death? Spiritual death, rejection of God. Symbolically, we become stench to God if we're not following Him and faithful to Him, if we're not living the proper life. Cultures become stench-like when they rebel or turn their back on God. The imagery, you can go on and on and on. Yes, it's devastation. But let's keep going. Unless there are other thoughts this time. For it is the day of the Lord's vengeance. And we've talked before about God singing. It could seem like if you didn't know him, this egotistical maniac, homicidal, just going to destroy everything. But is God's vengeance ever just totally out of nowhere? No, it's always justified. It's always righteous. For it is the day of the Lord's vengeance, the year of recompense for the cause of Zion. Excuse me. Its streams shall be turned into pitch, and dust into brimstone. Its land shall become burning pitch. It shall not be quenched night or day. What is pitch?
Sap from a tree.
It could be set from a
Or it
tree,
could
but
be
many times
the bituminous oils from the
petroleum-based, it would be something that could burn. We know that they could have, Noah actually covered the ark with pitch for waterproofing. But here, when he's talking about this, its streams shall be turned to pitch, its dust to brimstone. What's the imagery there? Fire. Look at what it says in verse 10. Or 1, its land shall become a burning pitch at the end of verse 9. It shall not be quenched day or night. Are there any other different translations there at the beginning of verse 10? An everlasting, unending type fire. It does have a lot, or sounds a lot like judgment. Hellfire damnation. Again, why is it there? Because they've rejected God. They've sold their birthright. They've not held true to what is important. Its smoke shall ascend forever, from generation to generation. It shall lie waste. No one shall pass through it forever and ever. Now let's look at the next few verses. Because as Lee said, this desolate land, this torment, this land of punishment, sounds a lot like hell. But the pelican and the porcupine shall possess it, the owl and the raven shall dwell in it, and he stretched out over it. The line of confusion, the stones of emptiness, thou shalt call its nobles to the kingdom, but none shall be there, and its prince shall be nothing. Thorns shall come up in its palaces, nettles and branches in its fortress. It shall be a habitation of jackals, a courtyard of ostriches. The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the jackals, and the wild goat shall bleat with its companions. All the night creatures shall rest there, and find for herself a place of rest. The arrow snake shall make her nest, and lay eggs, and hatch, and gather them under her shadow. There also shall be the hawks gathered, every one with their mate. This land and all the mightiness, what the fortresses, you see places of power, you see places that used to be fortified, that used to have a majesty about them. What are they now? Desolate. But what comes in and takes the desolate place, or the place of the desolate? It's right there in the text.
night creatures.
Night creatures.
I think all these animals would be considered unclean.
Every one of these animals.
They're not.
Well, they're not to be eaten, but according to the old law, these are not. These are unclean. You abstain from them. So this unspiritual people who reject their birthright, reject a relationship with God, have no desire to be holy or pleasing to God, who brings their own death upon them because of their sinfulness. It's this concept of being unclean. Anything else there that we've missed? And as he goes through this, and all these unclean animals that inhabit this great land, it used to be great, it's nothing now because God's judgment is bringing it there. Look at what he says in verse 16. Search from the book of the Lord and read. What's that mean? Search from the book of the Lord and read. There's a lot of figuratives going on here. Now, it can be figurative, but it also could be literal. What would happen, whether it's talking about the book of Isaiah or talking about the books that have been written, or the scrolls that have been written? What is there?
For if you will seek my face, and if you will turn to me and pray, I will heal the land. There was in the blessings that would come for faithfulness, the cursings that would come for unfaithfulness, and in all respects, whether you were born into the Hebrew lineage or whether you were a proselyte into the Hebrew nation, you could come to the Lord by his covenant and through his covenant, and all the answers were there. You know, why are you doing this to us, Lord? Well, the answers are all there. The solution is there.
There's never been a point where God hid himself. Seek first the kingdom of God. Search the book of the Lord and read. And I know that we've talked about it in classes lately, whether sermons or Sunday mornings or what. When Christ himself came, what did they do? They rejected him. But they should have known exactly who he was. Anything going on in this text, anything that God's talking about, anything that Isaiah is talking about, they shouldn't be fretting and they shouldn't be wringing their hands or their work. They should understand if you don't do God's will, what you expect. And as Lee's also pointed out, whether in covenant, whether the Hebrew nation, or whether outside proselyting, God can be found by searching his word. So search the book of the Lord and read. Not one of these shall fail, not one shall lack her mate. For my mouth has commanded it, and my spirit has gathered them. Basically, when God speaks, he's told you what he's going to do. It's not a surprise. It's not going to just fail or fall apart. This is God's message. It's his judgment on the people for disobeying him. Joe, when I read that my mouth has commanded and my spirit has gathered, I couldn't help but think back into our Holy Spirit class about that spirit brooding. God's spirit is enacting and doing God's will, preparation. He has cast lot for them. He has divided among them a measuring line. They shall possess it forever. From generation to generation they shall dwell in it. So I do see this desolation land, but there's a sense that there will be desolation forever for those who are always rejecting God. And that, I guess for me, and not to try to get too literal too figurative into it, but it is the eternal punishment, those folks that have turned their back. Remember, we had Edom, and now we're going to chapter 35. The wilderness and the wasteland shall be glad for them. We already start to see, we've had all this bitterness, we've had this destruction, we've had death, we've had blood, we've had this stench, we've had all these things, we've had these unclean animals. Wasteland shall be glad, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice, even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it. The excellence of Carmel and Sharon, they shall see the glory of the Lord. The excellency of our God. So you automatically, right off the bat, see what kind of shift. Folks that turn their back on God, who had nothing spiritual, to folks who are looking at God's word. Are you?
Yes, I was waiting to you.
That's fine. I like it when you squirm and kind of.
There is no number 35 in the original text.
Okay.
It flows straight through there without a gap. And we do a disservice to what God is saying to Isaiah when we pause and separate it right there. Notice It doesn't say the people of the wilderness will be glad. It says the wilderness will be glad.
The land.
Because the scourge of people has been wiped clean, and God is starting over again. There's a renewing here, that all of the sins of man are going to be dealt with, and it's by this, your translation said rose, others say crocus, and the idea there is a bulb. The crocus is a bulb that's planted and waits for its proper season when it is watered. So God has planted the bulb of Messiah in the land, and when things are right, when the fullness of time comes, it will bloom forth.
And it's going to be a beautiful fragrance.
And it's going to be a remaking. And that's the transition from the situation that mankind was in before Christ and the situation that the church is in after Christ. There are still some who are going to suffer in the wasteland. They're going to suffer the eternal punishment of God. But there is now a blossoming hope.
It shall not be quenched day or night, smoke shall so there's always that mark of those that don't. But it is such a beautiful thing. And like you're saying, well, like you're pointing out, what they were going through, what they were seeing at the time of their renewal, their cleansing, because God used these other countries to cleanse them in a sense. But we also see today, and we also see the future of what will be to come. I mean, you see 3 or 4 different time frames here, if that makes sense. Blossom, verse 2. It's not just showing one, but this is abundantly and rejoice. Even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon. When Lebanon, the word comes up, I always think of the cedars of Lebanon, the best trees. When God wanted something built, that's where we went to get the wood, the lumber. This glory of the greatest, the excellence, seeing the glory of God and the excellency of God. Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. In this new renewal of the land, those that struggle with unbelief are not going to, the shifting from unbelief to belief. Say to those who are fear-hearted, be strong, do not fear. Behold, your God will come with vengeance. With recompense of God, he will come and save you. So, a renewal of the land, for us, we look forward, the salvation of our souls, the building, the messianic promises. There's so many different things going on here, but they didn't know what we know today. He will come. Salvation is in God. Look at verse 5 and 6. What New Testament passage does this sound like? Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the dumb shall sing.
John sent his man to Jesus and said, are you the one, or should we look for someone else? And Jesus said, what do you see?
That's exactly right. And that puzzles us, or puzzles me in the New Testament, why John would ask that when he's seen this kind of stuff. It's evident. The purpose of these miracles, the purpose of these signs. When we question Christ, are you the Messiah? He didn't have to sit and give a defense. His life gave the defense. For the waters shall burst forth in the wilderness, and the streams in the desert. You get this idea back to 34 that everything was desolate, everything was wiped out. The unclean lived there, but now we've got these streams, this oasis is now coming forth. And you can't help but think where Jesus is telling the woman at the well, this life-giving water that you're going to drink of. The thirsty land of springs of water, in the habitation of jackals, where each lay, there shall be grass with reeds and rushes. Renewal, refreshing. We've gone from desolate to beautiful, lush, growing things. The change in scenery. The difference between being outside of Christ and being inside of Christ. You're only welcome to join in there anytime. I like verse 8. A highway shall be there, and a road. It shall be called the highway of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it, but it shall be for others. Whoever walks the road, although a fool, shall not go astray. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast go on it. It shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. That's beautiful. A highway, what's it called? A highway shall be there, a road, and it shall be called the highway of holiness. The Edomites, those of the way of Edom, those that are unspiritual, that bring death, decay, destruction, the stench, the desolation of the land. And now there's a highway. If you go back, look back at chapter 11. Look back at chapter 11 and verse 16. When Isaiah in chapter 11 is talking about a reign of Jesse's offspring, he's talking about this future. There will be a highway for the remnant of his people, who will be left from Assyria as it was for Israel. In the day that he came up from the land of Egypt. We know about how, as they were led out of the land of Egypt by Moses, there was a way prepared. With Moses, they came to the Red Sea. It would part. God took them, God led them. And here you got this highway concept, a highway of holiness. Who's going to dwell on the highway of holiness? I saw a few lips move, and I heard a little grumble back there.
The redeemed.
The redeemed, God's people, those who do not ignore him, do not turn their back on him, who appreciate their birthright. But what does that mean to be redeemed?
It means you're in a relationship, you're bought back.
We're bought back. Look at verse 10. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return. We know that word ransom. We know that if you take somebody and you hold them for ransom, you're waiting for them to be bought back. God's people that have been bought back, how? By the blood of Christ, are going to be walking this highway. And on this highway, will be no unclean. It's not for the ravenous beast that we've just read about previously in chapter 43 or 34. It's not for all these unclean animals, but it's God's bought back, purchased people, his remnant. Because God always provides, God takes care of them.
In the end of the book of Revelation, there's similar imagery that's there when Jesus said, "Behold, I make all things new." And there he's talking about the church emerging from the persecution of the Romans. It doesn't mean that there will never be trouble again. It means that God is going to bring victory out of that apparent defeat, and he is going to overcome the powers of the world. If you think about the imagery of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, when Nebuchadnezzar dreams the dream of the golden statue, or the head of gold, and it's a sequence of nations. And then there at the foot, it's in the days of those kings I will establish my kingdom. And so all of this desolation is leading up to the coming of the Christ. And out of the desolation of all of those empires and the negative effect it had on the Hebrew people, out of that, behold, I make all things new. And so now they're going to be truly a people where you once weren't a people. You will have mercy where you once did not have mercy. And now you truly will be a kingdom of priests and a royal priesthood, whereas that always was my ideal, but it's never what you fulfilled. And so this imagery of God bringing his people out of the clutches of man-made tyranny is found both here in Isaiah and also in the book of Revelation. And it's a beautiful thing of that protection that we have. We may lose our life, but our spirit will dwell with the Father forever.
And I appreciate when you first started off, you talked about we were never promised for it to be easy. And sometimes when we're young Christians, or the world may think, kind of like a joke, you put that little hedge around it. We're not here for a hedge to be placed around us. We're here for this promised land. And it is beautiful imagery. He started off, like you said, he went all the way back to the deliverance out of Egypt. We see it with the coming of the Messiah. We see it with them that God, they failed. They turned their back on God, but God comes through and punishes them and causes them to come back to him. It's the cycle throughout life. But God has promised to be there. God has promised to deliver. He's always able to be found. He's not hiding from us. Gary, you certainly.
Yeah, it's interesting too. And notice water plays a role in this as well. And we see in Jeremiah, of course, where they had rejected the fountain of the living water. And then, of course, in John, we see the woman at the well. And Jesus tells her that you drink the water that I provide, and you'll never thirst again. And so here we have this all-important thing that we all need. And you can't, you can go without food for a while, but you can't go without water even for a day.
Right. Or not long at all.
Not long.
And not only just in the drinking, but we see the imagery of God throughout the history of time as redeeming the world with water. Moses is a baby, Noah in the ark, crossing the Red Sea, cleansing, our baptism. The end of verse 9 again, we jump down to 10, but no lion shall be there, and I automatically in my mind race to Peter where Satan is the lion wondering about looking to whom he can devour. That type of destruction is not going to be on God's highway. The redeemed shall walk there, and the ransom of the Lord shall return back, and come to Zion with singing, everlasting joy on their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Again, we struggle, we have tough times, but at our core as Christians, there should be joy, there should be gladness. Yes, I have things that kind of throw me for a loop and might put me on my butt for a minute, but overall we are to be people because of our relationship and our covenant with God and what He has promised us and the leading that He is doing in our lives on this highway, taking us to Zion, where He's protecting His people. It brings a peace. And we've got to share that. We've got to communicate that within our fellowship, within our body. Any other thoughts at this time?
Well, I'm encouraged when he says even the fool will not go astray. If I'm on the path, I follow it.
There's much said in the commentaries about the fool, whether it's saying the simple or the ignorant or the foolish person that rejects God. But basically, the imagery there is that if you're on this path, you're not going to be led astray. People that are on this path are the people that are, whether they're simple or whatever the case may be, it's not the foolish idiot that's going to be placed on this path. But if you're on this path, you're there because you're following God, you've given your life to Him, and you're determined, you've committed yourself to Him.
The New American Standard and several of the newer translations say that the fool will not wander onto it.
Right. That's what they kind of alluded
Right.
to.
And so it's not Joanne's not a fool that can't wander off of it. She is the wise that has come onto it.
The unclean of 34 will not be on this path with us.
It's seek out the word of the Lord, which we saw at the end of chapter 34. It's the discerning that find a way to life. The fool doesn't just happen upon the roadway.
And you can also kind of, it's hard to see in the New King James, even though that's what the commentators point out. Whoever walks the road shall not go astray. You can kind of, you have to search hard, but you can see that it does say that the unrighteous will not be in the presence of God on this highway. So that brings us great comfort that if you're in here following, I say in here, I don't mean here in this building, but if you're on God's pathway, it's a commitment of those who have sought Him and are looking towards His book and His will and His teachings.
It's intentional.
Intentional, thank you. Well said. Guys, I appreciate your participation. See you again next week.